Well, when we last met with the Holy Family, this past Monday, it was January 6th, and the Magi came to adore the Christ child on the Epiphany. Now, interestingly enough, the very following day, Tuesday, January 7th, and the Roman Martyrology skips forward 7 years and gives us this: the feast of the bringing back of the child Jesus from Egypt. So between the infancy of Christ and today, Christ being 12 years old, we have this little interim feast, which is not on the liturgical calendar and it's not in the Roman Missal, but Tuesday, the 7th of January, was the feast of the return from Egypt of the Holy Family, the bringing back of the child Jesus from Egypt. Now, by tradition, they were there for 7 years. So we go from his infancy to him being 7 years old, and now to his being 12 years old. So let's review just a few events during this time. And then tomorrow will be the octave day of the Epiphany, and between today and tomorrow he goes from being 12 to 30, where he's baptized. Now in another couple weeks then we'll revisit his infancy one last time on the Feast of the Purification of the Blessed Virgin, his presentation in the temple, which is Candlemas. And that will be the conclusion of the Christmas cycle, as we call it. But we'll save that for February 2nd. But let's quickly review these events between Epiphany and the finding of the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple. Now, Catherine Emmerich, or Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, writes in the life of Jesus Christ, in this 4-volume set. It is a private revelation. We could call it a meditation upon the Gospels. And Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich was a nun, lived a few hundred years ago. She had the stigmata. She was, confined to her bed for years, and she had never been to the Holy Land. And she dictated her visions to a priest who wrote them down. And as historians and scholars and the pious alike have examined her descriptions of the Holy Land, they find them to be so precise, considering that she never went there. And it is one of the things that gives credence to her visions, that the Lord gave her these very accurate visions of a place that she had never been to. Well, let us listen then to Anne Catherine Emmerich's visions or meditation upon this time period. So we begin then with the return from Egypt when the child Jesus is 7 years old. I had a glimpse of the boy Jesus, now 7 years old, as he walked between Mary and Joseph on their journey back to Judea from Egypt. I had many visions of the journey, which was made without any special danger to them. Mary was often very much distressed because walking through the hot sand was so painful for the boy Jesus. Joseph had made for him out of bark shoes that reached above the ankle where they were firmly fastened. Still, I saw the holy travelers frequently pausing while Mary shook the sand out of the child's shoes, and she herself wore only sandals. Jesus was dressed in his little brown robe, and they often had to seat him on the ass. For protection against the scorching rays of the sun, all three wore very broad hats made of bark and fastened under the chin with a string. I saw them passing by many cities, and at last I saw them in Gaza, where they stopped for 3 months. There were many pagans in that city. Joseph did not want to return to Nazareth, but to go to Bethlehem. Still, he was undecided because he had heard that Archelaus was now reigning over Judea, and he too was very cruel. But an angel appeared and put an end to his doubts by telling him that he should return to Nazareth. Anne was still living, and this refers to St. Anne, the mother of the Blessed Virgin Mary. This is the grandmother of Jesus. Anne was still living. She and some of her relatives were the only ones that knew where the Holy Family were during all those years. There were 3 separate rooms in the house at Nazareth, that of the Mother of God being the largest and most pleasant. In it, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph met to pray. I very seldom saw them together at other times. They slept alone, each in a separate room, and the bed consisted of a cover which in the morning was rolled up. At the age of 8 years, Jesus went for the first time with his parents to Jerusalem for the Pasch, and every succeeding year he did the same. In those first visits, Jesus had already excited attention in Jerusalem among the friends with whom he and his parents stayed, as also among the priests and doctors. They spoke of the pious, intelligent child, of Joseph's extraordinary son, just as amongst us one might, at the annual pilgrimages, notice in particular this or that modest, holy-looking person, this or that clever peasant child, and recognize him again the next year. So let us pause here and think about this. If there are things that you go to every year, and whether it's something religious or maybe you go to visit a particular resort or a particular town or something for a festival, or maybe at the annual Walk for Life, and there are people there that you don't know, you've never met them, but you see them every year. Or maybe you go on a business trip and you see certain people over the years because you're always going to the same place, and you don't know them, but you sort of do because you've watched, the children grow up, or you see the same family every year, and you might think to yourself, well, boy, that sure is a pious family. You have an appreciation for them. Or you might think, well, boy, those kids are not behaved well. Or you might think, boy, those kids really have matured a lot, or they seem to, be so respectful of their parents, or whatever. You have observations about people you see regularly that you don't even know. So that's the context that she's speaking of here. That Jesus was known by those, and the Holy Family was known by those who would see them regularly, even if they didn't personally know them. So Jesus had already some acquaintances in the city when in his 12th year, with their friends and their sons, he accompanied his parents to Jerusalem. And that brings us to today's gospel. His parents were accustomed to walk with the people from their own part of the country, and they knew that Jesus, who had now made the journey for the 5th time, always went with the other youth from Nazareth. But this time Jesus had, on the return journey, not far from the Mount of Olives, separated from his companions. His companions all thought he had joined his parents, who were following behind. Jesus had, however, gone to that side of Jerusalem nearest to Bethlehem, to the inn at which the Holy Family, before Mary's purification, had stayed. Mary and Joseph thought him on ahead with the other Nazarenes, while the latter thought that he was following with his parents. And when at last they all met at Gophna, the anxiety of Mary and Joseph at his absence was very great. They returned at once to Jerusalem, making inquiries after him on the way and everywhere in the city itself. But they could not find him, since he had not been where they usually stayed. And Jesus had slept at the inn before the Bethlehem gate, where the people knew him and his parents. And there he had joined several youths and gone with them to 2 schools of the city and to a 3rd school at the temple, and in the afternoon into the temple itself, where his parents found him. Now Jesus, by his questions and answers, so astonished and embarrassed the doctors and rabbis of all these schools, that they resolved that on the afternoon of the 3rd day, in the public lecture hall of the temple, and in presence of the rabbis most deeply versed in the various sciences, that they would humble the boy Jesus. Well, the scribes and doctors had concerted the plan together, for although they were pleased at first, they had in the end become vexed at him. As Jesus had in the schools illustrated his answers and explanations by all kinds of examples from nature, art, and science, the scribes and doctors had diligently gathered together masters in all these branches, and they now began one by one to dispute with him. Jesus now answered and taught upon medicine. He described the whole human body in a way far beyond the reach of even the most learned. He discoursed with the same facility upon astronomy, architecture, agriculture, geometry, arithmetic, jurisprudence, and in fine upon every subject proposed to him. and his hearers, surprised and confounded, passed successively from astonishment and admiration to fury and shame. They were enraged at hearing some things that they had never knew before, and at hearing others that they had never before understood. Now keep in mind, this is from a 12-year-old. They don't know that he's God. He's a 12-year-old. They're being shamed and embarrassed and enraged by this 12-year-old who's telling them what they don't know. Well, Jesus had been teaching for 2 hours when Mary and Joseph entered the temple. They inquired after their child and received for answer that he was with the doctors in the lecture hall, but they were not allowed to go into the lecture hall. And so they sent one of the Levites in to call Jesus. And Jesus sent them word that he must first finish what he was then about. Well, Mary was very much troubled at his not obeying at once, for this was the first time that he had given his parents to understand that he had other commands than theirs to fulfill. And so he continued to teach for another hour. And then he left the hall and joined his parents in the porch of Israel, the women's porch, leaving his hearers confounded, confused, and enraged. Joseph was quite awed and astonished, but he kept a humble silence. Mary, however, drawing near to Jesus, said, "Child, why hast thou done this to us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing." But Jesus answered gravely, "Why have you sought me? Do you not know that I must be about my Father's business?" But they did not understand. They at once began with him their journey home, and the bystanders gazed at them in astonishment. And I was in dread lest they should lay hands upon the boy, for I saw that some of them were full of rage. I wondered at their allowing the Holy Family to depart so peaceably. Although the crowd was dense, yet a wide path was made to permit the Holy Family to pass. When Jesus returned to Nazareth, I saw a feast in Anne's house, his grandmother's house, at which were gathered all the youths and maidens among their friends and relatives. I know not whether it was a feast of rejoicing at Jesus' having been found, or a feast solemnized upon the return of the Paschal journey, or a feast customary upon the completion of a son's 12th year. But whatever it may have been, Jesus appeared to be the object of it. There were present at this feast 33 boys, all future disciples of Jesus. And I received an instruction upon the years of Jesus' life. During the whole feast, Jesus instructed the other boys and explained to them a very wonderful parable, which, however, was only imperfectly understood. It was of a marriage feast, at which water could be turned into wine, and the lukewarm guests into zealous friends. And again of a marriage feast where the wine could be changed into blood, and the bread into flesh, which blood and flesh would abide with the guests until the end of the world, as strength and consolation, as a living bond of union. He said also to one of the youths, a relative of his own named Nathanael, "I shall be present at your marriage." And that brings us to the threshold of next Sunday's gospel, which is that of the third manifestation of the Epiphany, the wedding at Cana. So that story will need to wait until next week. And so in the meantime, I wish you a blessed feast of the Holy Family and a continuation of this octave of the Epiphany. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.